Thanks for having us. And just to kick us off, I'd like you guys to both talk a little bit about what you have to do with VR and healthcare, because it's maybe not an obvious combination, right? So maybe, Mary, do you want to talk about what you do?
Sure. So at Next Galaxy, we focus on developing VR applications. Currently, we're working on training in VR for medical providers as well as for patient education. And then we have hardware to support consuming VR as well.
Hi, so I'm a professor here. Actually, my lab is right across the quad. We have several different VR programs in the lab. One of them, the main one, is to build video games that are presented in virtual reality environments. And we use these games as training tools, training of the mind to enhance cognition. So it's not didactic education, it's not instructing you in any way, but through gameplay and through these feedback loops that we build into the game engine, the point is that we could strengthen how your brain functions and improve cognition.
So these two know a little bit about VR and how it's helping our brains to change and learn, and especially in healthcare. Mary, can you kind of set the stage for us? What's happening in the space right now?
I think a lot of what's happening right now, most of VR is being used for training. So for example, some of the projects that we're working on, we're doing a CPR module where people can actually practice CPR. So having that live real-time feedback while you're practicing versus having these passive experiences of just watching a video. So a lot of training of healthcare professionals, and then also doing procedures that typically doctors or other providers cannot practice without, let's say, using a live person. So those type of things are what's happening now. A lot of training within medical fields, not across VR as a whole, right? The reason why we decided to focus on VR for healthcare is because you see about 99% of the efforts in VR today are focused on gaming. And most of it is teaching people to kill. So we figured, well, if we can use VR to teach people to kill, we can teach them to use it to save lives as well.
So how realistic are we talking about when you're developing these games or these programs to teach people CPR and other methods of healthcare? How realistic are we getting?
It's very real. We recently had a focus group. We had doctors, EMT, and also parents. And the feedback that we had after they tried the CPR module, a lot of people felt that, wow, they felt very competent. They felt like, well, if something happened, they would actually know what to do. And a lot of people also, felt that they could relate more to the subjects rather than to the patients, rather than just watching it on TV. So that's something that I think it's a big differentiator with using VR, because people are creating actual memories. So you see people sweating as they come across, the victim at the park or, whatever the different scenarios that we had. So the ability to create these real-time memories, it allows them to learn in a more endemic way than if you just watch a passive video. So it's very realistic.
Adam, what are you seeing in the space? What's kind of interesting to you in the space right now?
I echo everything Mary said. I mean, we know that most of the applications and what the hardware companies direct their efforts towards encouraging are entertainment tools. There is some communication and media applications out there, but that's the lion's share of where the attention is right now. And the first thing I'm excited about is the hardware itself. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Maybe I could get a little information from this audience. Who here has been in a head-mounted display, very recent, something in the 6 month, like the latest technology? Okay, so it looks like maybe 2%. So there's a big surprise for those of you that have not. The latest head-mounted displays, and there are probably 4 or 5 leaders in the industry, will be landing starting in a month or two and then going all through 2016. And when you see what these look and feel like, you will be amazed and your jaw will drop open. It's really not subtle how immersive and real the experience is.
So the head-mounted displays have actually been criticized as looking really dorky. People don't really want to wear them. But if you do put them on, they're kind of really awesome. I mean, it's an extremely awesome experience. It's just getting over that hump of you're going to look like a giant dork right now.
I mean, I don't think it's going to be for everyone, right? It's certainly not the type of thing you'd wear in a social setting likely, but they're not really made for that. If you are someone that enjoys playing video games or potentially not in the distant future sporting events, watching sporting events, and you already sit at home, oftentimes by yourself, it's not that much of a leap. So, I think it depends on what the person is doing and what their goals are. So, maybe it's not going to be as prevalent as mobile phones, but there's a lot of gamers and a lot of people that are looking for this type of immersive experience. And it will leave the gaming world. It will enter the world of commerce and the world of communications and media. And there's a reason Facebook acquired Oculus, and it will enter our world of healthcare. So I think that once it hits all those markets, there will be a lot of people using it, dorky or not dorky.
Right. And then also for some of the medical schools that we're working with and the hospitals, because it's a required tool that they need to be able to use, so it really doesn't matter how they look. And there's some cool ones coming, so that are not as bulky. So
I mean, I've seen gamers wear these headsets and get really into it too. I mean, that's also kind of dorky. So
right.
There's hope maybe. Speaking of working in hospitals, so we talked about some of the academic applications of learning CPR. What's going on in the hospitals?
In the hospitals, we are currently working with a group that does training for elderly care facilities. So they train the providers, or they train the healthcare professionals about things like tracheal intubation. And so for things like that, it's very, very costly. It's about $2,000 to $3,000 per employee to train. You've got 65,000 of these facilities, and the turnover is very high. You have about 50 new employees that have to be trained on an annual basis. And the problem with a procedure like that is one of the blind procedures. So you cannot practice on, let's say, a cadaver because the person has to be sitting up. So when they insert the tube, you're perforating windpipes, you're doing all kinds of stuff because they can't practice except on a live human patient. So in places like that, we are creating the VR experience. They can get in there, they can feel what it feels like to insert a tube, what it feels like to perforate, windpipe. Hopefully they don't do that, but they can feel all of this. So when you're on a live patient, they don't have to worry about that patient being practiced. So that's one example. There are other things that we're working on that's coming down the line on, doctors learning how to even do injections, Botox, and other critical procedures. So.
Critical procedures.
Right.
So I actually have to say, because I have tried some of the different VR headsets, and it's very realistic. That's a great application. You put it on, and it's kind of incredible. It messes with your head. It tricks your brain into thinking that you're moving and moving forward and moving backwards and up and down, and you really feel like you're there. So that's probably a really good application. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of the training, we don't do that type of software design in our lab, but I definitely see its benefit. I mean, I went to medical school and did residency, and when I went, and it's still very much the case, we had this sort of practice of do one, see one, teach one. If anyone has been to medical school, you sort of know about that, where the first time you're confronted with a procedure, someone's showing you how to do it, and the very next time you're doing it, and then you're teaching someone. And, for some things, it's pretty low grade, but other things it's pretty scary. And if you're going to fly a plane, you have countless hours of simulation time, and the ability to simulate an experience and give you that 1 in 1,000 challenge more frequently than 1 in 1,000 is really exciting. So I think for training surgeons and other physicians in practices that are really, really hard to do through just education, you need to do it through experience, it's going to be really game-changing.
Is most of what we have in VR and healthcare, is it mostly just training? Are there other applications?
Most of what we're working on is training. A lot of what we're seeing now is training because of all the benefits. in the future, we're going to see more stuff such as diagnostics. A lot of telemedicine, I think, is going to look completely different. One of the things that we're researching is using force feedback so that doctors on one side of the earth can, feel and touch a patient across, the other part of the earth. So you're going to see telemedicine change. So if I can feel and touch somebody that's not here and be able to feel a lump or other things, then diagnosis will be much, much better. So I think we're going to go from training to, other means of diagnosing patients across the world.
Wow.
And then there's also an emerging field of therapeutics. And the therapeutics are incredibly exciting. I mean, some of the early research done by other groups, for example, in pain management, you might be familiar with the game Snow World. The idea behind it was to create a really engaging, immersive virtual reality experience for people that were going through bandage changes from severe burn injuries. So the bandage change experience is an incredibly unpleasant one, both for the patient and the practitioner, and it's just something that's unavoidable. And this game was used as a very powerful distraction tool during that procedure, and even studies that compared it to standard like morphine and very strong sedatives showed that it was equally effective in many ways. The ability to step out of that experience into Snow World was a very cold world, which was sort of offsetting the burn experience, but that idea is just one of many therapeutic examples in terms of managing pain. And then if you step just to another type of pain, emotional pain and anxiety and phobias, there's an incredible amount of work going on, a lot of like USC, Virtual Iraq, and other programs that put people into traumatic experiences, but in a very controlled, gradual way, surrounded by a support system. So the first time that you experience trauma is not deep in the field with no one to go to for help or to work through it, but you get to do it in a much more controlled way before you deploy. So that's two examples of really exciting, still research phase, but will eventually be, I think, really widespread used therapeutic tools.
And one more is for highly contagious diseases. So to be able to, work on a patient without the doctor being put at risk or the medical professionals being at risk, so through VR.
That's very interesting. What's going on in that space? I want to hear more about that.
So there is a lot of what's going on in that space now is research. So it's again leading back to the diagnosis. So for doctors here that can diagnose patients elsewhere, whether it's Ebola or something else that's very highly contagious, there are things that they can look for using the VR within that space without having to be in the same space with the patient.
It seems like a lot of what we're talking about right now is in the research and development phase, and kind of maybe within academia at this moment. How do we get that out of academia? What are we looking for in the future?
In terms of training and education, it's out there now, right? The app for CPR is going to be available on iOS. It's going to be available on all phones and Android too, very shortly. And most of these training modules are actually going to be available within months. But with the VR as a whole is quite new. It's even some of these big companies like what Oculus is doing with Facebook, they've only been around maybe a couple of years. So I think we still have a lot of time before you see most of these things actually hit the field. So it's still very research-based, but we're doing most of these inside the hospitals, not in, academic settings. So I think that would move much, much, much faster into the hands of the doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's hardware, I'd say right now. VR was like a promise for the future starting like in the 70s, and we're still not there. We will be there undoubtedly within the next year. We'll see VR headsets even start appearing this year. So when you're developing software and the target of what you can do is moving, it's really challenging. And so developers, largely, in the game world, as you might imagine, are, constantly struggling with the fact that the resolution's changing, the latency's changing, the form factor, and the way you communicate, whether it's Bluetooth or optical. And then there is all the accompanying peripherals of VR, right? So the virtual reality experience is always considered, the first thing people think of is the head-mounted display. But when you're in a VR display and you can't see your hands, it's a very disembodied feeling. So suits and gloves and ways of bringing the rest of you really elevates the experience. So all those are being developed as well. So I'd say over the next year, once those are solidified, at least the first commercial release version takes place across these big 5 or 6 platforms, then the software world will start escalating, and that's what I think will be the tipping point in like a year and a half, when all of this new amazing software across these multiple verticals is starting to arrive in people's hands.
We hear that a lot of the time we hear at TechCrunch and beyond other people, the buzz is that VR is the next platform after the internet. That is the next wave. That's where we're headed. What's your take on that?
I absolutely, believe that VR is the next platform, and the reason for that is it's not going to be in the form that most people think, the desktop with the Oculus. It's going to be mobile VR. And, everyone today has a mobile phone. I think there's 7.3 billion people on the earth, and there's something like 6 billion phones, right? You can go to anywhere on the planet, and people have mobile phones. And these mobile phones are so much more powerful. I was looking at, something that said the basic iPhone has more processing power than all of NASA did back in '69. So with these phones, that's what's going to drive VR usage. So mobile VR headsets that you can just slide your phone in and be able to have access to all this information and whatever else you have. It is the next platform, and all you have to do is look right down the line at the top 10 largest technology companies, and every single one of them has a mobile strategy. It's not even a matter of, are you going to do mobile? The question is, what is your what is your VR strategy? And that's also what's going to allow it to take off compared to what happened, back in the 70s.
Go ahead.
I would just maybe expand the discussion to include another technology that's very related called augmented reality. And so for those of you that are not following the super geeky topic, augmented reality is where there's an overlay on the real world. You'll see that in glasses. Maybe one version of it is Google Glass, and HoloLens, which is Microsoft's project, is another. There's another company, Magically, working on that. And it's like virtual reality. I mean, virtual reality has sort of come to take all of those where you can't see the world at all. You have an opaque lens. But this is mixing in very complicated ways as technology advances. So once you put in these different form factors where you can still see the world and interact with someone and have an overlay, and if you consider VR to include that, which is fair, I mean, I think it's the sort of an extension of the same concept, then it is reasonable to say that this is the next platform in terms of how we interact with digital technology. I mean, it will be, if you think 5 or 10 years out, it could be, the most dominant way that people interact in these digital worlds.
People didn't believe that when they heard of the internet either. They thought, oh, that's a passing fad. VR, another passing fad. We can see you kind of have this. You're looking over the edge of the cliff and telling maybe everybody else, hey, we're about to hit this point, right? So what are you seeing as the next wave in VR in terms of healthcare? Are you seeing maybe a new trend coming that we haven't really discussed yet?
I think the biggest trend in terms of over the next few years would definitely be going from that 2D passive way of learning to a more immersive, fully immersive experiential learning using VR. And then we're going to go to the different levels in terms of telemedicine, and all of that is going to have a whole new meaning in terms of patient care and patient education. So.
Yeah, I mean, the training aspect is really profound when you think about the brain. So there's many ways of VR having an impact in healthcare through this, but I'm a neuroscientist, so I look through that lens. And, our brains are really essentially is mirrors of our experience, and it could be quite extreme, right? We know some young man or woman deploys off into war, and one single event that takes place over a couple seconds changes their life forever, right? They never escape it. They have PTSD. They lose their job. They come back. It's just a single event, right? So that was an experience that changed their brain so profoundly that it impacted the quality of the rest of their lives. And that idea, flipping it around and saying, if experience can induce change in such a negative way, if we could control that experience and make it rich and deep, in the same way that real life is, then we can maybe rewire those circuits that went awry or help correct other types of neural diseases or deficits that are associated with impairment. So from the neuro and psychiatric side, I see massive potential to create these amazing experiences and control the interaction in such a way that you can guide someone's brain to a healthier state.
You know, it's, for whoever hasn't tried a VR headset, I would highly recommend it just so you have a good understanding of what is possible, because it really makes you feel like you are in this other world. So I could see that happening, retraining your brain in a way that you're surrounded in this world and in this environment that's very conducive to making you feel like you're really there.
Yeah, the other powerful part is the software interface. So we, in our lab, and we have many video games that we've developed as these cognitive enhancement tools. Only one project is in VR right now because it's so early, but the idea behind it is that you create what we call these closed loop systems. So when you interact with our games, whether it's a non-VR or a mobile game, the game is recording your performance, and we could record other aspects of your physiology as well in real time. And then it uses that data to scale the environment and the challenge appropriate to you every single second. So essentially, it's just pulling all that information out and then making a very personalized decision about how you are capable of receiving information and interacting with it. And this closed loop feedback that just keeps building on itself, we're showing is a very powerful way to change the brain and to harness the plasticity that our brains have. We see this even in mobile devices, but the idea is that if you could put this in a virtual environment where the experience is just so much more richer and real, then you could even lead to greater changes. So that's why we're so excited about it in our lab.
Speaking of, we were talking a little bit earlier about the way the headset looks right now, and you know, we just have to accept that it's going to look kind of dorky, and that's what it is. Do you see in the future the design changing in such a way that maybe we have contact lenses, or we have something else that's maybe not as noticeable, that makes it maybe more appealing? I think that was part of the problem with Google Glass, is it wasn't very appealing to people. The design just wasn't very attractive.
But I think a big part of, in addition to people not liking the design because it was the monocle, a big part of Google Glass also was the price point, and that it was very additive, right? It just added information to your normal environment. So the value there for consumers was not as high as where the value is for consumers within VR. We've probably seen over 10,000 people that have tried on VR headset, and everybody goes, wow. I haven't had one person that said, oh my God, this is, I don't like this. Everybody's question is, wow, when is this going to hit the market? So I think that the value that it adds to the experience is really, going to be a game changer also. And in terms of the device itself, the trend is to get it smaller and smaller, lighter and lighter, to where it's just a pair of glasses. So it's kind of like the big brick mobile phones that we had in the beginning. It's the same thing. We're going to go from these big devices that you put on your head and to having a pair of glasses, or maybe even just lenses. And with all these new materials that we have out there, you've got things like graphene and others that are changing, material science. Who knows what's going to happen 5 years from now, and how we, wear these VR devices.
This is so interesting, because I hear of these inventions all the time. You can imagine we get pitched TechCrunch, and I read these things and people talk to me about things, But it always seems like it's fits and starts, like we're just almost there, we're almost there, we're almost there, and we're not quite there, and then it just takes forever to actually get us to that point. And you were saying maybe 1.5 years out, we're going to see a massive explosion in adoption, or what are you thinking in terms of this becoming actual mainstream? Do you think it really is maybe going to take 1.5 years? Do you think it's a little further out than that?
Well, we know, at least the reports are that Valve's device, which is called HTC Vive, is expected this holiday season, and then Oculus and Sony and Samsung and other companies, some of which are stealth, all have devices in the first half of next year. So I think we've been waiting and waiting, but unless something crazy happens, there will be a lot of very, very high-end VR headsets out in the next 6 months. And people, there have been tens of thousands of developer kits out there. So people have been creating software already, and some of it's really sensational, and not all in games. There are movies and tools, and so I think that it's, a year from now, the conversation will be very different.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying entertainment also drives, new platforms, and one of the things that people are going to be using this for is watching movies, because if I can be inside of the movie or have an IMAX experience right at my home, that's exactly what I want to be able to do. Music concerts, and, in addition to healthcare, we do entertainment too, but those type of things have such grand mass appeal, and that's what's going to drive adoption. And yes, it is happening now. Google Cardboard is already shipped over 500,000,
Right.
and all these different headsets that are coming too. You're going to have millions of people adopted, along with the content as the content becomes available.
That does kind of sound cool, though. You can walk into the movie and walk around the characters, and I don't know if you are familiar with a series called The Nick, but it's set in the probably no one knows about this, but it's set in the 1900s, and it's about these surgeons in the 1900s, and it's very bloody and gory, but it's really fascinating. But anyway, so I thought that would be interesting with VR. But for me, maybe not for everybody. Yeah. So we were talking a little bit about backstage. Some of this is personal for you. You have family members in other parts of the world where mobile is very important. What do you foresee as adoption over there in terms of VR?
I think as these units get cheaper and cheaper, we're going to be able to get them to other parts of the world.
Yeah.
As I was sharing with you, my father lived in Ghana, and he was misdiagnosed for something as simple as malaria, and he ended up dying. And so for parts of the world where people want access to health care, just learning basic things like wound care and basic procedures, learning more about vaccinations, just simple things. For them to be able to have this type of access is going to be extraordinary. And everybody has a phone.
Everybody has a
phone,
phone,
yeah.
Google Cardboard, $25. But I have to say, so I got my brother Google Cardboard, and he went, okay, that's nice, whatever. It wasn't really. He kind of likes the high end stuff. So it's. I think it's good to have that the lower end for mass adoption. But the worry is, okay, well, we have this cheaper priced VR headset, and then we have these higher priced. What are you going to choose? But it seems like there's maybe a market for both.
Yeah, I think that from a global perspective, it's incredibly exciting, and I could just tell where I'm being asked to give talks on these topics. I'm heading to Africa next week, and I was just in South America and Middle East and China, and it's just a very global conversation because as challenges with accessibility of healthcare and education. A lot of the invitations are just in the education space, so we haven't really talked as much about that outside of healthcare, but it has the same type of potential of delivering an experience to people that are otherwise just unable to expose themselves to that. And so as the entertainment world drives it and drives costs down and drives down the size and increases the affordability, I think we'll see a massive globalization of this whole field.
Yeah, and new jobs and new types of software and all sorts of new things. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about where we can go with this in the future with healthcare. Where do you think, we were talking about sensory before, maybe how far away, I don't think anyone's working on that right now, right?
There are a lot of companies that are working on sensory, not as many as companies that are working on the visual feedback, but there are companies working on tactile feedback where through
Seems a lot harder to do.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Through a pad, you can actually feel like the skin of a crocodile, or you can feel textures. Where our hardware, which is an audio device, has haptic feedback, so you can actually feel vibrations, which helps improve the sense of presence, the sense of feeling like you're actually there. So you have a few people, that are looking at the sensory, because there are a lot of elements required to create that sense of presence and that sense of realism. So, a lot of people at work. So not as many, but it's happening. I've seen some really cool stuff in this area. A lot of force feedback devices, a lot of things that allow you to see your hands.
Or maybe
And
people who are missing a limb, or they can kind of feel that phantom limb.
yes,
Yeah, work on
yeah,
that. Yeah.
that's been really incredible. At CES last year, we had. People in wheelchairs that tried it, and that feeling of once they take it off, saying, wow, I actually felt like I was flying or walking, or, so you have those types of sensations as well.
What are you seeing in the space? Are you seeing any, I don't know if you deal with any of the tactile sensory.
A little bit, but the same things. We call it haptics, and that whole world of getting information in through touch has been really challenging. But there are, lots of companies working on it. It's definitely a missing piece. But the motion capture piece of it is probably what I see outside of the visual and sound, right? So that's another thing. Like most of the headsets will also have headphones, 360 sound. So that's, when you see a giant whale go by you and you're underwater and you hear it, and it's, it's a full experience because the sound is also 360. And the fact that you could reach out and see your hand in this space, those things alone, those three things really sort of almost do the job. But obviously tactile will be another, but it will be the last. But I think it'll be there.
Yeah, so it's all well and good to talk about something, we talk about tech all the time. We're surrounded by this all the time, but there's a whole world out there that may not even know this exists. And there's, disadvantaged populations. How do we get this kind of technology out to them?
A big part of it is through, one, entertainment, because there are a lot of people that will pay for all kinds of, entertainment, but they will not pay for just basic needs, right? So that's definitely one way and to drive the technology.
Everyone in the third world has a TV and...
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Almost every home has a TV. Everyone has a, I read a stat from United Nations that there are more people with access to mobile phones than to toilets, so in the world. So one, through the entertainment, but also through the school systems. I think when you look at a lot of schools today, we're still using, turn of the century type education. We're still using textbooks, when these experiences could be so much more. People can be engaged with it. Most kids don't want to give back the VR headset. They want to live in it. They want to live in this other world. So if we can bring that into the classrooms where their first exposure to VR and to this type of immersive content is through the learning process, I think is going to go a long way also. And then through, things like what we're doing with healthcare, where it's a required part of the, certification, or through schools where it's a required part of the curriculum. So all of that is also going to help expose people to it that otherwise wouldn't have access to it.
Couldn't have said it better?
Yeah,
All right.
perfect.
And Adam, I understand you work on some programs with the elderly as well, retraining their brain and therapy with the elderly. Can you talk about a little bit about your work there?
Yeah, so we do a ton of work on trying to improve how the brain functions in older adults, even independent of things like Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. So as we get older, our brains are not always at the same level. That's something that we've observed in our lab for a long time, and many labs have shown that. And if you can train the brain through experience, through interactivity, largely due to with gameplay, we've shown that we can reverse several of the neural and behavioral and cognitive changes that we're seeing. And we're still at the very beginning of this, but we do look at these tools as really powerful digital medicines in a way. And in the healthy older population, maybe it's not a medicine, but a wellness tool. But we are also building games that are now just about going through the FDA approval pathway. The first game, which was from my lab and went into a company I helped co-found called Achille, and they're just about to begin an FDA approval trial for a therapeutic for ADHD using a video game. Now that game is on a mobile device, which is a smart decision because virtual reality doesn't really exist in terms of having a lot of headsets out there, but there's no doubt that it will bridge over to that world.
So this is kind of interesting for me to hear because this is the first time I've ever heard of a game needing FDA approval. But like all healthcare, there seem to be regulatory issues.
Yeah, so the reason why is if you build a game and say, okay, this is for your memory and maybe you have some evidence, you need some evidence for that, and we're seeing more of the FTC stepping in when those claims are not strong. But that's fine. The FDA is not interested in that per se. But if you say, if you have Alzheimer's disease, you have ADHD, if you have depression, major depression, if you have a clinical indication, you need FDA approval. And this type of software falls into the medical device pathway, and you basically go through it like any other therapeutic and have your side effects and your effects judged and pick your primary endpoints. And so we're looking at a future where I believe doctors will pull out a prescription pad and write out, video game, iPad, 2 months, and be able to follow the data remotely, because unlike a pill, this is collecting data all the time. So it's both a therapeutic and a diagnostic in a loop. So yeah, I think that's what we'll be looking at very, very soon.
That's fascinating that you're able to see not only how your patients are interacting with the game in real time, possibly, but also that it's seen as a prescription therapy for people.
That's the idea. We
Yeah,
still have a little more work
we're not
to
there
do.
yet.
We're not there, but it's
clear.
not far away.
Yeah.
I think in the next 2 years we'll see that.
What kind of results have you seen so far? Can you share those with us, or is it too early?
I mean, the results are positive, but you want to go through large-scale trials with multiple groups. The idea is if you're going to introduce something as different compared to the standard small molecule approach of pharmaceuticals, we go through the same process. We're like, okay, let's just hold everything the same except this intervention and see if we could reach the same outcomes. So that's the goal now. So yes, pilot studies are encouraging, but that's not enough. We need to go through the full distance of showing that it's efficacious and also minimal side effects, which we expect there to be minimal, maybe not none, but certainly less than we see with a lot of pharmaceuticals where we know the side effects are pretty large.
Right, you hear those really long list of side effects. It seems so nice when the announcer lists them off.
You're like, side effects are fun, and now
you might experience bowel disease and blindness. Yeah, exactly. How difficult is it working with the FDA? Did they have any kind of precedence for, how to deal with this new kind of technology?
There's a little bit on the diagnostic side, but this is a pretty new conversation. But they are very open-minded. When it comes to the brain, there has been a lot of frustration around our therapeutic system. We do not have well-targeted therapies. They act generally on neurotransmitter systems, and so you have to boost doses to very high levels to get the effects you want, and then you get side effects, and they're just poorly targeted. The idea is that maybe these pharmaceuticals can have a second life if you could lower the doses, use a game technology to activate a brain network in a specific way, and then have them work together. That's another exciting idea. We almost know nothing about that world yet. So we have a lot of work to do in this new field, but the FDA is very excited about it because there has not been any major cures when it comes to neurological psychiatric diseases in terms of cognition and improving it.
Are you seeing the same on your end in the software that you create, or do you have to deal with FDA at all? what you're making?
The hospitals, these are issues that have come up, especially with looking at even some of the haptic feedback and the force feedback devices as medical devices, or when you put certain things on a phone now, is the phone a medical device? So those are things that have come up, and the hospitals are really going to help us address a lot of those issues, but it has come up.
That's something I think is really interesting too. It's beyond VR. Is that your phone is becoming, in essence, your own doctor or your own medical. It is a medical device in some sense. I mean, we're seeing that with different apps and with, certainly with, Google Cardboard VR. You could use it that way with different games. Pull up an app to see your doctor. And even I've seen apps that there's different products where you pee on a stick and you take a picture in the app and they know if you're pregnant. It's sort of weird. It's awesome. It's not FDA approved yet, but but someday maybe. But it's coming down the line and it's really kind of exciting. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very exciting. I think it's going to be a profound change in healthcare as all of this new technology starts becoming part of the healthcare system. But we're seeing, from all the many startups, and a lot of why we're here is because of that, but even, everything is sort of a healthcare company now. I mean, Amazon and Google and Apple, and all of them have healthcare divisions and life science divisions, and I think there's a real excitement in tech and hardware and software fitting into the medical world and the wellness world, which has also become a blurrier line. So I think it's incredibly exciting. We've really had a very sort of siloed system of therapeutics in terms of small molecules. And I think that small molecules are just going to become way better when they're integrated with all of these ways of both assessing information in real world, in real time, and also delivering it to people in that way.
Yeah. Last thought for both of you, because we're almost out of time. What would you say would be the measure of success for VR in healthcare?
I think that, for a lot of the diagnostics, so looking at anabolic diseases, being able to get to the cellular level using VR, and being able to really change the term telemedicine when it's truly telemedicine, where you can be in the same room with a patient, when a doctor can be in the same room with a patient, look into the patient's eye, and exchange, information. That is what we will consider a true, success in VR.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with that. It's really well stated. I think that from my perspective as a neuroscientist and a neurologist, I've seen so many efforts at helping us live longer. I mean, that is a worthy goal, but we live pretty long, and we suffer, many of us, for the end of our lives in a pretty dramatic way. And I think if VR, because of this experience that it creates, has the potential to not just live long, but even live better. And so that's what my whole focus is on quality. And I think when people are really saying that, wow, this device, both hardware and software, has improved the quality of my life and my mind, that will be the win.
And you're talking about neurologically better, not we live in a simulated reality better.
Yeah, I tend to not think that the future, in this concept of singularity, is really offloading our brains into computers, but using computers and hardware and software and all the things we're talking about to improve the function of our brain so that the quality is here. That's what I think the promise is.
Oh. All right, well, you've both been lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.